Imagine living in a town so cursed by bad luck, or bad law, that it managed to execute an innocent man. Twice. Yes, you heard that right. Not one, but two wrongful executions in the same tiny community. Our story today sounds like a morbid legend, a place where Lady Justice took a coffee break and left two fellas to dangle. If you think one wrongful execution is a nightmare, stick around, because this town turned it into a twisted tradition. Meet Sagewood, a picturesque American town with white picket fences, friendly neighbors, and in the 1930s, an overzealous urge to solve a crime at any cost. The saga begins on a hot summer night of 1936. A heinous crime shakes the town. A local teenage girl is found murdered in her bed, and her younger sister is left wounded but alive. The community is terrified and outraged. Pressure mounts on the sheriff to catch the culprit yesterday. Newspapers scream about a monster on the loose, and the townsfolk want justice with a side of revenge. In other words, a perfect recipe for a historic blunder. Enter Joe, a 21-year-old drifter passing through town. Joe is a gentle soul with the mental capacity of a child, the kind of guy who loved playing with toy trains and smiling at strangers. Unfortunately, he also fits the narrative of a convenient suspect. Why? He's an outsider, he's a little different, and as fate, or misfortune, would have it, he was spotted near the railyards around the time of the crime. To the panicked town, that was enough. Sheriff George Carroll, under tremendous pressure to calm the public, hastily collars Joe and interrogates him. Now, when we say interrogate, picture something less good cop, bad cop, and more bad cop, worse cop. The sheriff quickly realizes Joe is suggestible. He's eager to please and easily led. So Sheriff Carroll starts asking leading questions, essentially playing Mad Libs with a murder confession. If you like girls so much, why do you hurt them, Joe? He prods. Joe, confused and scared, nods along and mumbles whatever the sheriff seems to want. Before long, voila, Joe confesses to the brutal murder, despite having no clue about key details like how the crime was committed. He didn't even know the weapon was an axe until the cops told him. To call this a dubious confession is an understatement. In fact, decades later experts would note that people with severe intellectual disabilities are frighteningly prone to false confessions under pressure. But in 1936 Sagewood, nobody's checking interrogation ethics. They've got a signed confession, and that's good enough for a quick trial. The trial is a farce from the start. Joe's defense attorney desperately argues that Joe has the mind of a 6-year-old and couldn't possibly understand what's happening, let alone mastermind a murder. But the prosecution paints Joe as a cunning fiend hiding behind a feeble mind act. The townspeople pack the courthouse, scowling at Joe. They've already made up their minds. Someone has to pay for the crime, and if it's the wrong guy, oh well, at least somebody gets punished. Let's talk evidence, or the lack thereof. Apart from the shaky confession, the only physical evidence was a single strand of hair found at the scene. Instead of admitting they had basically nothing, the authorities brought in a self-proclaimed forensic expert. This expert peered at the hair through a microscope and declared it matched Joe's hair, based on ethnicity. Yes, you read that correctly. He claimed the strand had characteristics of American Indian hair, which somehow to him proved Joe was the killer. Never mind that Joe was actually of Syrian descent, not that it should matter, and the real perpetrator, a different man entirely, was of indigenous heritage. Logic took the day off. The jury ate up this pseudo-science because, well, science-y words in 1936 impressed people. In reality, visual hair matching is notoriously unreliable. Nowadays we know it's about as scientific as comparing lint by eyeballing. But back then, it gave the trial a veneer of legitimacy. Even more absurd, the surviving victim, the younger sister, testified there was only one attacker, and she didn't recognize Joe at all. She actually identified a completely different man, Frank, a 35-year-old who had recently worked for her father and been fired, as the person who assaulted her and killed her sister. And guess what? Police had already arrested that man before Joe, and he confessed to the murder independently. Frank, the real killer, explicitly said he acted alone and had never even met Joe. So if you're keeping score, the known killer is in custody and headed for execution, but the town still decides to prosecute Joe as an extra murderer, basically for good measure. Why on earth would they do this? Welcome to the twisted logic of Sagewood's justice. The sheriff and his deputies were rewarded with $1,000 bonuses each for solving the case after Joe's conviction. That's about $20,000 today, quite an incentive to wrap a case up neatly, truth be damned. And Sheriff Carroll was not about to return that paycheck by admitting he'd nabbed the wrong guy. pride, pressure, and a nice pile of cash all screamed, full steam ahead. So Joe Eerie, as history remembers him, was convicted of murder and sentenced to death in the gas chamber. It didn't matter that Frank, the actual murderer, had already been executed the year before Joe's sentence was carried out. Yes, you heard right. The actual killer was executed, and then the town went, you know what, let's execute the other guy too, just in case. In Sagewood, redundancy isn't just for power supplies. Apparently it applied to executions as well. On January 6, 1939, Joe was led into the Colorado State Penitentiary gas chamber. Since Sagewood handed him over to state authorities for execution, witnesses say Joe smiled at the prison warden right before being strapped in. In his simple mind, perhaps he still didn't grasp that this was goodbye. In fact, Joe's lawyers had pointed out he couldn't even understand what an execution meant. He had the comprehension of a little kid. The warden himself grew so fond of Joe on death row that he gave Joe toys and even begged the governor for clemency. But political ambition won out. The governor refused to stop the execution, not wanting to seem soft on crime as elections loomed. Thus, Sagewood's first wrongful execution proceeded. Joe was asphyxiated by cyanide gas while still proclaiming his love for the warden and insisting he wanted to stay at the prison. He thought he had friends there and was safe. It was a tragic, somber scene. One seasoned reporter said the state would struggle to live down the disgrace of this execution. And live it down they did not. Many in the community had second thoughts almost immediately after Joe's death. As the years passed, the oops became undeniable. Evidence of Joe's innocence mounted, from the coerced confession to the lack of any logical motive. Decades later, Colorado's governor officially issued Joe a full posthumous pardon, acknowledging that the conviction was a grave mistake. It took 72 years for the state to say, "Our bad," a gesture far too little, far too late. There was no big inquiry or overhaul of the justice system. If anything, the powers that be seemed to think, well, that was awful, let's just hope it never happens again. Spoiler, it did. Fast forward a few decades, and you'll see why Sagewood earned the dubious title of the town that executed the wrong man, twice. If you're shaking your head at the sheer absurdity of this first case, you're not alone. But don't go anywhere, because the next part of our story somehow manages to top this tragedy with an even more baffling twist. In a moment, you'll find out how Sagewood repeated its deadly mistake and executed yet another innocent man. Think the town learned its lesson? Think again. Our story jumps to the late 1980s. Big hair is in, shoulder pads are wide, and Sagewood has grown from a small town into a modest city. New mayor, new sheriff, same old hunger for quick justice. It's been about 50 years since Joe's case, and while it's whispered about in some circles, mostly as a ghost story to scare law students, the general public's memory has faded. After all, most of the 1930s generation are gone. Sagewood's collective psyche has, it seems, reset itself, and that's when mistake number 2 comes barreling down Main Street. This time, the crime is a late-night gas station robbery gone wrong. A female clerk, working the graveyard shift, is stabbed to death during an apparent hold-up. It's a brutal crime that once again shocks the community. The new sheriff, let's call him Sheriff Daniels, is determined not to let chaos and fear fester. One might cynically note he's also eager to prove himself tough on crime. Local elections are coming and nothing boosts a campaign like catching a killer. Officers quickly detain a suspect found hiding in a neighborhood nearby, a young Latino man named Carlos. He's found not far from the scene, looking suspicious, by which we mean he was in the vicinity and ran when he saw flashing lights. Not great optics, but also not proof of murder. Carlos insists from moment one, "I didn't do it. I saw another guy run that way." He even gives the other man's name, a name that, if anyone bothered to check, would have raised serious eyebrows. According to Carlos, the real perpetrator was an acquaintance named Carlos Hernandez, who fled the scene leaving Carlos, the suspect, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yes, 2 Carloses. This is already sounding like a bad soap opera plot, but bear with us. Now, an experienced investigator might think, our suspect is pointing to someone specific, let's verify if that person exists. But Sagewood's finest weren't in the mood for extra legwork. Instead, prosecutors at trial scoffed at Carlos's claim, literally calling the alleged alternate suspect a phantom, a figment of Carlos's imagination. In their narrative, this second Carlos was just a desperate lie by a guilty man. They confidently told the jury, "Folks, there is no other Carlos, don't be fooled by ghost stories." The irony? Carlos Hernandez was very real, and not only was he real, but he was already known to law enforcement for, wait for it, stabbing people during robberies. In fact, Hernandez had a track record of similar violent crimes and had even reportedly confessed to friends that he committed the gas station murder. One of the prosecutors secretly knew Hernandez existed, and was bad news, but opted to hide that tidbit, while publicly branding him a make-believe scapegoat. Let's pause to appreciate the absurdity. This town's justice system wrote off a flesh and blood person with a criminal resume as a fantasy, and confidently marched forward to convict Carlos, the suspect. Instead, it's almost as if Sagewood was doubling down on the mistakes of the past. Real killer on the loose. Mayor, we've got a convenient fall guy right here. The trial of Carlos, suspect, in 1989 was a replay of the worst hits of 1936, just with bigger hairdos in the jury box. Key evidence hinged on a single eyewitness who thought they saw Carlos during the crime. Eyewitness testimony, as compelling as it sounds, is notoriously error-prone. Humans are really bad at recalling faces under stress, especially across racial lines or in chaotic scenes. But the prosecution leaned heavily on it. They needed to, because beyond that, their case was thinner than a dollar store paper towel. No murder weapon was ever found linking Carlos. No forensic evidence, like fingerprints or DNA, tied him to the gas station. His alibi, that he was nearby but not the killer, was ignored. Meanwhile, the actual Carlos Hernandez roamed free, likely chuckling darkly under his breath as he watched the evening news. In a deliciously dark twist of fate, Hernandez and our Carlos even looked uncannily alike, so much so that later, when investigators showed photos of both men to people, even their families mixed them up. Imagine sentencing a man to death when even his own relatives, shown a mugshot, go, that might be him. Or it might be the other guy who looks just like him. This is how sloppy the situation was. Yet, none of this gave the Sagewood jury enough doubt. They convicted Carlos of murder and the judge sentenced him to death. Perhaps the ghost of Sheriff Carroll, from Joe's case, was whispering in Sheriff Daniel's ear, "Don't worry, no one will ever find out." Spoiler: people found out, but not until it was too late. Carlos sat on death row proclaiming his innocence, while advocacy groups and journalists started digging into his case. This wasn't the 1930s anymore. The media and legal clinics were far more equipped to question a possibly wrongful conviction. Sure enough, a few intrepid reporters and a law professor unearthed the disturbing truth. Multiple pieces of evidence strongly pointed to Carlos Hernandez as the killer, and authorities had willfully ignored them. The story made headlines. Did Sagewood convict the wrong Carlos? The town that had brushed one wrongful execution under the rug was now confronted with the prospect of another. You'd think at this point the governor or courts would slam the brakes. After all, the pattern was eerily familiar. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and the wheels of justice, or injustice, kept turning. Appeals court judges often don't like admitting a system error unless new evidence is absolutely bulletproof. In Carlos's case, a lot of the proof of innocence was uncovered a bit too late, or deemed not new enough. Despite the troubling revelations, the courts denied relief. It's a harsh reality. Once someone's convicted, and especially once they're executed, courts generally won't entertain innocence claims. Lawyers move on to saving those who can still be saved. And so, in December 1989, Sagewood, via the state, executed Carlos by lethal injection. This time no smiling warden, no toys or innocence of mind. Carlos died angry and pleading that they look into his friend, the other Carlos, even as he was strapped to the gurney. It was a quieter affair than Joe's execution decades earlier. A few reporters, some officials, and a last statement in which Carlos said, "I am innocent. The real killer is still out there." The witnesses to the execution mostly shook their heads, chalking it up to a criminal's denial. Little did they know, within a few years, the truth of this second wrongful execution hit the public like a thunderbolt. A major investigation laid out the case in excruciating detail. Sagewood had indeed executed an innocent man. Again, the alternate suspect, Carlos Hernandez, was very much real, had a violent history, and had reportedly confessed multiple times. In a gut-punch epilogue, it turned out one prosecutor on the case knew Hernandez personally and was aware of his crimes, yet helped dismiss him as a phantom in court. The level of official misconduct and willful blindness was staggering. Public reaction ranged from outrage to morbid jest. Is something in the water in Sagewood? One newspaper quipped, horrified that the same town could err so catastrophically twice. Others demanded to know if anyone would be held accountable. Answer: not really. A couple of officials got stern talking tos, maybe a career setback here or there. But no criminal charges for what was essentially negligence of life and death information. the town of Sagewood got its name in headlines again, forever linked with not one but two fatal miscarriages of justice. Civic groups and reformers descended on Sagewood, holding candlelight vigils at the courthouse and demanding changes, better police training, accountability for prosecutors, perhaps even an end to the death penalty in that county. How could they trust a system that had gotten it so horribly wrong twice? Embarrassed and under fire, the local government finally did some soul-searching. A task force was set up to review both cases, albeit decades too late for the victims of these injustices. New rules were proposed, for example, no single witness conviction in capital cases without corroborating evidence, and mandatory DNA testing where possible. In fact, since 1976, over 190 people sentenced to death in the US were later exonerated before execution, and it's broadly accepted that some who were executed were later proven innocent. We've explored the how, frantic investigations, flimsy evidence, biases, and a stubborn refusal to admit error. But perhaps the bigger question is why the lessons weren't learned the first time. Is it human arrogance, the blind faith in our institutions, or something rotten deeper in the system? Most importantly, it forces us to ask you, the viewers, what do you think? Could a fiasco like Sagewood's happen again in modern times, even with all our advances in forensic science and law? Or have we finally put these ghosts to rest? If your town made one fatal mistake, would you ever trust it to administer justice again? And who should be held accountable when the justice system itself becomes the villain? These questions remain unanswered, and we're curious to hear your thoughts. Was one of Sagewood's wrongful executions worse than the other? Did the town's officials deserve punishment for their roles? And does knowing stories like this change your view on the death penalty? Or justice system at large? Let's talk about it in the comments. After all, only by confronting these questions can we hope to avoid the dark legacy of places like Sagewood in the future.